Welcome everyone to our Summer PD series. My name is Carrie Checka and I'm the PYP coordinator at Mount Daniel and Thomas Jefferson.
I'm Jen Fessenden. I'm the Pre-K-12 coordinator of mathematics for the school district.
FCCPS has identified some best practices in education for distance learning. This asynchronous module is all about the practice of feedback. Our objectives during this module are to take a look at the FCCPS reopening plan to see what the research says about feedback, to gain an understanding of what effective feedback is, to hear from some of our very own FCCPS teachers and how they use feedback during distance learning, and to take a moment to reflect on our own feedback practices and commit to feedback implementation. Before we move on, I'd like for you to take a moment to think about and reflect on these questions. What is effective feedback? What does it look like? And what does it sound like? Think about those questions in both the context of the classroom and virtually. Please feel free to pause this video if you need to take a little extra think time.
As noted in the FCCPS reopening plan, approaching the reopening of schools during a pandemic requires a reflective lens focused on virtual distance learning. Moving forward in a blended model of instruction, it is critical that we take a moment today to identify some evidence-based best practices relating to feedback. Feedback is one of the most critical elements of student growth and understanding, and Hattie rates feedback a very high effect size. Anything greater than 6/10 is considered to have a huge effect on student outcomes. In the virtual environment, targeted feedback becomes even more important because of the lack of nonverbal cues as feedback and the ability to provide instant oral feedback in the face-to-face environment. When you're online, you're not able to glance across the room at a student or give them immediate face-to-face feedback. When feedback is timely, specific, understandable, and actionable, students assimilate the language used by the teacher into their own self-talk. Constructive and detailed feedback is how teachers can maintain their presence and expectations for the classroom, but also how students can truly understand where they are and where they need to go in order to be successful. It is imperative that the teacher consciously stay in touch and communicate with their students using technology according to clear timetables and using an established framework.
As I go through the next couple of slides, I'd like for you to think about your response to what feedback is. Look for similarities or for new information that builds on your understanding of feedback. John Hattie and Helen Temperley define feedback as information provided by an agent, and that can be a teacher, a peer, a parent, regarding aspects of one's performance and understanding. It is also information about a task or a goal that fills a gap between what is understood and what is aimed to be understood. This makes me think about our division-wide goal of closing gaps and just how important feedback is to do that. I shared what feedback is. It's important to understand what feedback should be. Feedback should be timely. The sooner the better. We've all been students and we know what it's like to have to wait to receive feedback on something that we work so hard on. Also, as teachers, we want to see how our students are doing. Were our lessons effective? What do we need to tweak? If possible, feedback should be given naturally in conversations during instruction or within a short period of time following an assignment. We realize that with distance learning, those during instruction conversations are a little bit more challenging. But luckily, we have tools like Schoology that we can use for synchronous feedback.
Feedback should also be specific. We should be providing learners with information on what exactly they did well and what they may still need to improve upon. If they are showing growth, let them know.
Feedback should be understandable. First, teachers must understand the gap in the students' learning, and then we must use words that students understand when communicating feedback.
And finally, feedback should be actionable. Students should be able to take action of the feedback given. Information is not enough alone to close the gaps. Think, what can the students do because of the feedback that you just gave them?
According to Hattie, effective feedback must answer three major questions. Where am I going? how am I going, or how am I doing, and where to next. Let's look at the chart. When giving feedback to students about where they are going, it is important to set clearly defined goals and success criteria for each learning experience. Your feedback can then relate to reaching success on the established goal. When providing feedback to students on how they are going or how they are doing, you will focus on clearly communicating the progress being made towards the goal. And when providing feedback to students on where to go next, you will focus your feedback on helping them to develop new goals that lead to deeper understanding and more self-regulation.
There are two main types of feedback that we often give to students: evaluative feedback and descriptive feedback. Evaluative feedback is quick and simple, but it unfortunately does not move student learning forward. Evaluative feedback includes things like grades, general brief comments like good job. It can provide some information, but it lacks the guidance on how to help the students improve. Descriptive feedback, on the other hand, does move student learning forward. It provides students with detailed and specific information about improving their learning, and it answers the 3 questions that Carrie just outlined in the previous slide. Descriptive feedback helps the learner to understand what he or she needs to do to improve and is a critical part of formative assessment. Hattie suggests that there are 4 levels of feedback. You can provide students with feedback about the task, thinking about feedback in terms of how well has the task been performed, what has a student done well, and what other information is needed to meet the success criteria. You may also provide feedback about the process. What strategies are needed to perform the task, and are there alternative strategies that can be used? You can also provide self-regulatory feedback. How can the student do a better job of planning, monitoring, and managing their actions and using strategies in approaching the task? This type of feedback is going to be the most powerful feedback long-term because students will start using that self-talk in their heads. And he also suggests you can provide self-feedback, but that self-feedback is not the type of feedback that moves students forward. Self-feedback is more evaluative feedback, and it also includes praise that directs attention away from the task and to the student itself.
There are different ways that feedback can be communicated. While today we are just focusing on teacher to student feedback, it is important to note that student to student and student to teacher feedback are also very powerful. In all 3 situations, the classroom culture is extremely important. Students need to feel safe to give and receive feedback and communicate honestly about their progress. Here are some important things to remember about teacher to student feedback. As Jen mentioned, it is best to use descriptive feedback about the task, process, or self-regulation as it relates to the 3 questions: where am I going, how am I going, and where to next. Remember, feedback should be timely. It can be written or face-to-face. Those in the moment, during conversation types of feedbacks are best, so when you have those opportunities, take them, whether it's in a classroom or in a Schoology conference.
We will now spend some time hearing from several FCCPS teachers and how they provided students with feedback during distance learning. The first video is Meg Flazier, a 3rd grade teacher at Thomas Jefferson Elementary School.
So I would respond, I would write comments on their work. And there were some students who were really good about responding to it and just saying resolved or thank you or I got it. And so I knew those students would be checking their comments. There was other students who would turn something in and kind of be like, I'm done, that's it. And so those were the students where I would still write comments. If I felt like there was a misconception that really needed to be addressed, I would forward the work to the parents and just say, hey, this is where we're at. You may want to check in with your student, or I'm going to set up a time that the 2 of us can talk online. Can you have your student log on at 8:40 tomorrow morning?
I loved the live Google Doc piece. I didn't realize how fantastic that would be with distance learning. Because, you know, when we were in school, I would kind of sit next to them and look over their shoulder. And this was better because there wasn't that sort of anxiety for them of this teacher staring over my shoulder right now. And they were really quick to respond to my responses, which was really nice. And in fact, one boy, I made responses at the end of class, and at the beginning of the next class kind of said, oh, you're going to want to go back and check these. And he goes, oh, I already did that. So it was really great.
And then through kind of reviewing responses at the beginning of class, showing them what an exemplary response looks like. I mean, just kind of continuing to show, or this is the standard. This is the standard. This is the standard.
Exactly. The easiest way for me to give feedback was to send a child a video. And that worked the best. With my thing.
In order for feedback to be useful, it must be both timely and specific. During our online learning, I used 3 different methods to provide feedback. Nearpod was the program I used when teaching synchronously. Can't say that word. It allowed me to watch each student in class as they processed a variety of math questions. I would create a mini lesson focused on thoughts and topics from the lesson. And then using Nearpod with the class, it enabled me to give immediate feedback. I was able to interact and question student thinking just like I would in the classroom. Students were also able to ask questions as they were learning and trying to understand new material. The second tool I used was for all students. Each student was required to submit work at the end of every lesson. Using the Schoology app on an iPad, I was able to comment on every paper submitted to me. I must be honest, this was the easiest thing ever. So I could write right on their papers. There were 2 things that I made sure of in order to make this type of feedback something I could do every day. Exit tickets were only 4 questions, and I made sure to always spend part of my day writing feedback that both asked questions of the students but also cleared up misconceptions that students had. Leaving comments for students was extremely involved since I knew that this might be the only time they read about their understanding of the work. The feedback on the formative was critical to let students know what they really understood about the daily lessons. Finally, the third component I used to help students learn the material was EduCreations. Every other night, I would create a 2-minute video using EduCreations that reviewed the material and went over common misconceptions seen throughout the class. This whiteboard app video was then embedded into my next day's lesson. Out of the 3 programs I used for feedback, I think my biggest concern was whether or not students would actually read what I wrote on their submitted work. I would love to come up with a way to ensure that students read what was written. But I'd probably say this is the same comment I would have had we been in the classroom together. In some ways, moving to a virtual classroom reminded me how important written feedback was. When I had students in the classroom, I used verbal feedback, and it was used regularly through small group and individual conferences. However, I also realized that some students needed not just that audio, but they benefited from the visual reminders that I was putting on my feedback forms, or that I was putting on their feedback for the papers. I gave notes and I gave guidance. All in all, no surprise here, students need feedback to better understand how they are doing. Thank you.
I started and I was typing all these comments and I'm typing all these comments and I'm typing all these comments and I went, you know what? Okay. They sent me a video. I can send them a video. So I went back and, if it was just a couple of things, okay, a typed comment was fine. But if there was more going on there and I could tell that, I would just turn on the camera and say, okay, here's what I heard. Here are the things that, if you are willing to try to fix, that I would love for you to be aware of in your next recording. And in that, then I could demonstrate things as well, and this content is so important. So I could say, all right, so when this happened in this measure, here's what I heard, here's what we want to hear. That was a lot. Once I realized I could do that, that allowed me a lot more flexibility. It was more authentic. It helped with the issue of tone in context. Sometimes when you type something and you're like, oh, did that sound the way it did in my head? So they could see my faces. They could read my expression, and they could see my support in trying to assist them in perfecting or cleaning up a performance.
Hi, Hi, I'm Miriam Schmoller and I teach 3rd grade at TJ, and I'm going to talk to you about the feedback I used in my classroom during distance learning. So my goal was to provide students with a personal connection, to receive feedback on their work, as well as to create a dialogue that resembled the type of authentic feedback that we use in the classroom. So in my classroom, we do a lot of collaborative work, and that's paired with reflection. I also do a lot of individual conferencing. So I created this Google Doc. I paired that with some 5-minute individual chats to create a feedback system that really helped during distance learning. I gave them each a 5-minute time, and for the most part, they really followed it. If they didn't make the video chat, I was able to communicate with them through some shared documents to see if they wanted to make up a time. I think the video chat was really important because we could talk about the work, and it helped me to know where the support was needed.
Hi, I'm Marlia Liebner. I teach Language and Literature Year 1 at Mary Ellen Henderson Middle School. Feedback is an integral part of my SBG course. I give specific and actionable feedback to students to help improve their objective and strand understanding. I'm going to talk about a few ways you can give feedback through distant learning. When reviewing submissions, I make notes about what students did well, what they missed, or still need to improve on in the commenting section, so students can review my comments at any time. Sometimes I write specific comments or standardized comments, but often I write a combination of both. My CT team writes a bank of actionable feedback when standardizing our grading. I then copy and paste the appropriate feedback in the comment section. Using a specific MYP rubric in conjunction with comments or not can also give students quick feedback. Rubrics can be modified to include task-specific clarifications for understanding strands in terms of the individual assignment. Schoology discussions allow for involved student-to-student feedback. Students are taught to use the assignment-specific rubric to leave encouraging and constructive comments for their peers. Pear Deck on student-paced mode can do basically the same thing as Schoology discussion. However, it seems to be a little harder for students to see their own feedback. I use the student completion feature on Schoology to allow students to see feedback on their progress of each lesson. Unfortunately, if you include an assignment, students aren't able to resubmit or view their feedback. In most lessons, we included a short exit ticket. Students were able to see their score immediately upon submitting. I would add an explanation of answers next time, though students used Schoology Message to ask any clarifying questions. Hopefully, one of these methods will make giving specific and actionable feedback fast and easy.
Thank you to all of the teachers who shared their strategies for providing virtual feedback to their students. It is important more now than ever that we pull from each other's strengths. Further professional learning about feedback, including some of the tools you can use, is being planned for the fall. In the meantime, we as a school division have committed to providing regular and timely feedback to promote learning so that students can truly understand where they are and where they need to go in order to be successful. We have put together a folder of feedback resources, including some quick infographics, if you would like to explore this topic further.
Thank you for attending our session today. We hope that you have a better understanding of what effective feedback could look like and sound like. Before you go, please take some time to reflect on how you might use some of the information to guide how you will provide feedback to your students in the fall.
We look forward to seeing you in person in August. Enjoy the rest of your summer, and thank you very much for your time today.